Sometimes the most powerful gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. The village of Thornwick had never known such desperation, clinging to the mountainside like a wounded bird as the first winter storms began to gather. When the Alpha King's blood-red banner appeared on the horizon, demanding his annual tribute of the strongest Omega, the townspeople made a choice that would echo through the ages. They selected Lyra Ashworth, the girl in the wheelchair who spent her days tending herbs in her grandmother's garden, overlooked by everyone who believed her broken body housed a broken spirit. But Lyra harbored secrets deeper than the mountain roots beneath her village. 23 years old, with silver-streaked auburn hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, she had learned to hide her true nature behind a mask of quiet acceptance. The townspeople saw weakness. They couldn't see the ancient bloodline that pulsed beneath her skin, dormant but not dead. As her wheelchair rolled toward the Alpha King's imposing castle, Lyra felt something stirring within her, a power that had been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to shatter every assumption about strength, worth, and destiny. What happens when the kingdom's most underestimated outcast meets the most feared ruler alive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cartwheels ground against frozen stone as they climbed higher into the Thornspine Mountains, each turn bringing Mira closer to a fate that felt inevitable as winter itself. Elder Corvin drove without speaking, his weathered hands gripping the reins like anchors against his own cowardice. Behind them, Thornwick had already faded into mist and memory. Mira pulled her threadbare cloak tighter, though the cold that bit deepest came from within. 22 years of life, and this rickety cart ride would likely mark its end. She pressed her lips together. Not that she could speak even if words might save her. The silence that had claimed her voice as a child felt heavier now, pregnant with all the things she'd never been able to say. The mountains watched their ascent with ancient indifference. These peaks had seen countless tributes before her, countless Omega girls deemed expendable by councils who measured worth in bloodline strength and pack hierarchy. Mira's bloodline was nothing. Her parents long dead, her wolf so weak it barely stirred even during full moons. Perfect qualifications for sacrifice. Castles just ahead, Elder Corvin muttered, his first words since they'd left the village square. His voice cracked like ice over deep water. Mira's heart lurched as obsidian spires pierced the low-hanging clouds. The Blood Moon Castle rose from the mountainside like a wound carved in black stone, its towers twisted into unnatural angles that hurt to look upon. No banners flew from its battlements. No light warmed its windows. It existed in perpetual shadow, even as the blood moon began its early rise above the peaks. The stories whispered in Thornwick's taverns had painted the Alpha King as a monster who fed on fear and crushed rebellion with his bare hands, a tyrant who demanded tribute not from need, but from the pleasure of watching lesser packs grovel. Mira had scrubbed enough floors beneath gossiping servants to know that Fenris Blackthorn ruled through terror, his very name spoken only in hushed tones. What the stories didn't mention was the strange pull she felt as they approached his domain, a resonance that hummed in her bones like a struck tuning fork. Something stirred beneath her ribs, unfamiliar yet achingly familiar, as if recognizing home after a lifetime of exile. The cart shuddered to a halt before gates forged from meteoric iron, their surface etched with protective runes that seemed to writhe in the growing moonlight. Elder Corvin wouldn't meet her eyes as he helped her down, his hands shaking. "I'm sorry, child," he whispered. Council's decision was unanimous. Mira touched his arm gently, offering the same forgiveness she'd given him 100 times before, for the scraps instead of meals, for the cellar instead of proper lodging, for the way even the kindest villagers looked through her as if she were already gone. Corvin's throat worked soundlessly before he climbed back onto his cart and urged the horses away, leaving her alone before the castle gates. The massive doors swung open without her touch, grinding against stone with the sound of tomb lids sliding away. Beyond lay a courtyard shrouded in unnatural twilight, where torches burned with flames that cast no warmth. Mira's feet moved forward of their own accord, drawn by that strange resonance that grew stronger with each step. Her soft-soled boots made no sound on the obsidian flagstones. Around her, the castle loomed in impossible silence. No guards called out, No servants scurried through corridors. No sounds of life disturbed the heavy quiet. It was as if the very stones held their breath. Yet she wasn't alone. Something watched from the shadows that gathered too thickly in doorways and alcoves. Not malevolent exactly, but broken in ways that made her chest ache with phantom sympathy. The air itself felt wounded here, split apart and badly healed. As she crossed the threshold into the main keep, ancient magic pressed against her skin like curious fingers. The protective wards that should have repelled an intruder instead parted before her, recognizing something in her presence that she didn't understand herself. Deep within the castle's heart she heard it, the sound of a soul in torment, fractured and fighting against bonds that held it prisoner. The blood moon reached its full glory above the mountain peaks, and with its light came awakening. 22 years of careful seals began to crack like ice in spring. The magic her mother had bound away stirred restlessly, responding to proximity of its perfect match. Somewhere in the shadows ahead, footsteps echoed, measured, powerful, approaching with the inevitability of fate itself. The Alpha King came to claim his tribute, unaware that the mute Omega girl trembling in his foyer carried the power to either damn them both or set them free. Mira's heart hammered as those footsteps drew closer, and for the first time since childhood, she felt the stirring of her own voice deep in her throat, not words but something far more dangerous, the truth, finally ready to break its silence. The footsteps stopped just beyond the reach of torchlight, and Mira found herself suspended between one heartbeat and the next, caught in a moment that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. The stirring in her throat faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only the familiar weight of silence that had been her constant companion for so long. How long? The question drifted through her mind like smoke. In this place where magic pressed against her skin and ancient wards parted at her touch, the careful walls she'd built around her memories began to crack. Images flickered behind her closed eyes, fragments of a life before the silence claimed her. She saw herself at 7 years old, laughing as she chased fireflies through Thornwick's narrow streets. Her voice had been bright then, quick to offer comfort to injured animals or lonely elders. She remembered singing lullabies to the baker's colicky infant, her small hands somehow always knowing exactly where to touch to ease pain. The other children had sought her out when nightmares plagued them, drawn by an instinct they couldn't name to the girl whose presence felt like warm honey and safety. That girl had spoken freely, fearlessly, had questioned why Omegas received smaller food portions, why they were forbidden from learning letters, why her touch could heal scraped knees and mend broken bird wings when the village healers could not. She'd been curious, confident, powerful in ways that made adults shift uncomfortably and exchange meaningful glances over her head. The memories blurred after that, fractured like a reflection in disturbed water. She recalled her mother's face, twisted with an agony that went beyond mere grief. Hands pressed to Mira's throat, magic flowing between them. Not healing magic, but something else. Something that felt like doors slamming shut, like vital parts of herself being locked away for safekeeping. For your protection, her mother had whispered, tears streaming down her face. They cannot fear what they cannot see. They cannot destroy what sleeps hidden. And then silence. 15 years of it, stretching like a vast ocean between the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. 15 years of scrubbing floors in Elder Corvin's house, of sleeping in the root cellar on a bed of old grain sacks, of being invisible in a way that went far deeper than her inability to speak. Her daily routine had been as predictable as sunrise. Wake before dawn to stoke the cooking fires, prepare breakfast for the elders' family while they still slept warm in their beds, scrub, sweep, mend, and clean until her hands cracked from harsh soap and her back ached from constant bending. Accept whatever scraps were left after everyone else had eaten, grateful for even the burnt porridge or stale bread crusts. But it wasn't the physical hardships that had worn her spirit thin. It was the way people looked through her, as if she were merely part of the furniture. The way conversations stopped when she entered a room, not from malice, but from simple forgetting that she existed at all. The way children who had once sought her comfort now flinched from her touch, trained by their parents to avoid the strange silent girl who brought misfortune. Even among the Omegas, the lowest rung of their rigid hierarchy, she'd remained apart. They at least could speak, could form bonds, could dream of finding mates who might value their gentleness if not their strength. Mira had watched from the shadows as they whispered about their hopes, their fears, their small rebellions against the roles forced upon them. She'd envied them their voices, their connections, their ability to rage against injustice, even if only in hushed tones. But more than that, she'd envied them their ignorance. They didn't feel the constant ache of power held in check, didn't wake each morning with phantom words burning their throat, didn't dream of touching the world with healing hands only to wake with fingers that tremble with suppressed magic. The other servants in Elder Corvin's household had been kind enough, in their way. Old Marta, the cook, sometimes slipped her extra bread when the elder wasn't looking. Young Tom, the stable hand, had shown her how to whistle bird calls, the one form of sound she could still make. They'd included her in their work, their quiet camaraderie, but even their kindness came with the unspoken understanding that she was damaged, broken, a object of pity rather than a person with her own dreams and desires. And what were those dreams? Standing now in the Alpha King's foyer, surrounded by magic that called to something deep in her bones, Mira finally allowed herself to remember. She'd dreamed of gardens where her touch could coax flowers from barren soil, of voices raised in song, hers among them, of using her gifts openly, without fear or shame, of being seen, truly seen, for who she was rather than what she lacked. The approaching footsteps had grown silent, but Mira could feel a presence watching her from the darkness. Waiting. The blood moon's light streamed through tall windows, painting everything in shades of crimson and shadow, and she realized with startling clarity that those dreams, the life she'd built in silence, the people who'd depended on her quiet service, the safety of being overlooked, all of it was already lost. The presence in the darkness shifted, and Mira's breath caught as a figure emerged from the shadows. But it wasn't the monstrous tyrant from Thornwick's whispered stories who stepped into the blood moon's crimson light. The man before her moved like liquid shadow given form, tall and lean with the predatory grace of an apex predator. Dark hair fell across a face carved from harsh angles and old pain, while eyes the color of winter storms assessed her with an intensity that should have terrified her. Everything about him radiated dangerous power, from the way his presence filled the vast foyer to the careful control in each measured step. Yet beneath that surface perfection, Mira saw what others had missed. Fractures ran through him like cracks in a mirror, so subtle they might have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years hiding their own brokenness. His left hand trembled almost imperceptibly before he clenched it into a fist. Dark circles shadowed those piercing eyes, and when he breathed, she heard the faint rasp of someone who screamed in his sleep. So his voice rolled through the chamber like distant thunder, cultured and cold. Thornwick sends me their cast-off. His gaze traveled over her threadbare cloak and patched dress with obvious disdain, a mute Omega who can't even look her king in the eye. The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to cut and diminish. But Mira had endured 15 years of being dismissed and discarded. She'd learned to find strength in spaces others couldn't see. Instead of cowering, she lifted her chin and met his stare directly. Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred defiance. For a heartbeat, the mask of cruel indifference slipped, and she glimpsed the soul trapped beneath. It called to her with the same resonance she'd felt approaching the castle, a harmony of broken pieces seeking their other half. "You're not what I expected," he murmured, and his voice had lost some of its calculated menace. He circled her slowly like a predator studying prey, but his movements held a strange hesitation. The tributes usually weep, beg, throw themselves at my feet, pleading for mercy I don't possess. Mira remained still, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. Up close, she could see the fine tremor in his jaw, smell the bitter herbs clinging to his clothes, wolfsbane and blood thistle, plants used to suppress magical gifts. The realization struck her like lightning. He was fighting something, holding back power that wanted desperately to break free, just like her. "You feel it too, don't you?" The words escaped him so quietly she almost missed them. His hand rose toward her face, then stopped just short of contact, fingers hanging in the air between them. The pull. The recognition. The blood moon reached its zenith above them, and with its full glory came a surge of magic so powerful it staggered them both. The ancient wards carved into the castle's stones began to resonate, humming with frequencies that made Mira's bones ache. The protective seals her mother had woven around her voice 15 years ago stretched like overtaut strings. Something was happening. Something that would change everything. King Fenris stumbled backward, his composed mask shattering completely as he pressed both hands to his temples. "No," he gasped, voice raw with sudden agony. "Not now. Not." The words cut off in a strangled cry, as power erupted from him in visible waves, dark energy crackling through the air like black lightning. The torches along the walls flared and died, plunging them into darkness broken only by the moon's crimson glow. Magic crashed against the castle's barriers, seeking escape, and Mira felt those ancient protections begin to crack under the assault. She should have been terrified, should have run screaming from this display of barely contained destruction. Instead, she found herself stepping forward, drawn by an instinct older than fear. Her own power stirred in answer to his call, 15 years of suppression finally reaching its breaking point. The king's eyes snapped open, meeting hers across the chaos of unleashed magic. In their storm-gray depths, she saw recognition dawn, not of who she was, but of what she represented. Hope and terror warred across his features as understanding crashed over them both like a cold wave. "You're the key," he whispered, voice breaking on the words, "the missing piece I've been searching for." His hand reached for her again, trembling with desperate need. "But touching you will either save us both or destroy everything I've fought to protect." The choice hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Mira could retreat into the safety of silence, return to Thornwick's familiar shadows, live out her days invisible and untested. Or she could step forward into the unknown, embrace whatever destiny called from the depths of her hidden power. Around them, the castle walls groaned under magical pressure. Cracks spread across ancient stones as two souls recognized their perfect, terrible match. The blood moon watched from above, and Mira realized that some choices, once presented, weren't really choices at all. They were inevitabilities waiting to unfold. The moment stretched between them like a held breath, and Mira felt the weight of 15 years pressing against her chest. The king's outstretched hand trembled in the crimson moonlight, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, yet she remained frozen at the threshold of decision. What if I'm not strong enough? The thought crashed through her like ice water, dousing the stirring power in her veins. She was no hero from the old stories, no legendary healer blessed by the moon goddess. She was just a broken girl who'd spent half her life scrubbing floors and sleeping in root cellars, who couldn't even speak above a whisper. How could someone like her possibly heal whatever darkness had fractured the most powerful alpha in their world? Around them, the castle's ancient stones continued their ominous groaning, cracks spider webbing across walls that had stood for centuries. If she touched him and failed, if her power wasn't enough to contain whatever force raged within him, would these walls crumble? Would the unleashed magic tear through the mountain passes to devastate the villages below? Thornwick might have cast her out, but innocent people still lived there. Children who'd played in the same streets where she'd once chased fireflies. "Everything I've fought to protect," he'd said. What did an alpha king need to protect? What responsibilities weighed on those broad shoulders beyond her understanding? She thought of the bitter herbs clinging to his clothes, the careful control that had finally shattered under the blood moon's influence. He'd been fighting this battle alone, holding back destruction through sheer force of will. And now he was asking her to risk it all on faith. "I don't know how," she whispered, the words scraping past 15 years of silence like rust flaking from an old blade. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, younger than her 22 years, uncertain as a child's. "I haven't used my power since." The sentence died as memories surfaced, her mother's tears, the feeling of doors slamming shut inside her mind, the terrible silence that followed. The king's expression softened at the sound of her voice, hope and anguish warring in those storm-gray eyes. "You don't need to know how," he said, though his own doubt leaked through the words. "The magic will guide us. It has to. It has to." Such desperate faith from a man who ruled through calculated cruelty. But what if the magic was wrong? What if whatever force had drawn them together was the same darkness that had corrupted him in the first place, seeking to claim her as well? Mira's hands clenched in her worn cloak as another wave of power crashed between them. She could feel his soul calling to hers, fractured pieces crying out for healing, but beneath that desperate need lurked something else, a hunger that made her skin crawl. Whatever lived inside him wasn't entirely him. She was certain of that now. It wore his face, spoke with his voice, but she could sense its alien nature like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect harmony. What if touching him lets it into me too? The possibility sent terror racing through her veins. She'd spent years watching the village priest perform exorcisms, had seen what happened when dark forces found new hosts. The screaming, the convulsions, the way possessed souls fought against the invading presence until something fundamental broke. She'd witnessed strong men reduced to gibbering madness, their families left to mourn the walking corpses that remained. "You're afraid," he observed, and she heard understanding rather than accusation in his tone. His reaching hand dropped to his side, though the effort clearly cost him. "You should be. This power, what it could do to you. What it could do to everyone," she whispered back, surprising herself with her boldness. The words tumbled out faster now. 15 years of suppressed thoughts finally finding voice. If I fail, if I make things worse, how many will die? How far will the destruction spread? King Fenris closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked impossibly young despite the harsh angles of his face. "The entire continent," he admitted quietly. "The barriers holding back the old chaos are already weakening. This castle sits on a convergence point. If the wards fail completely, the rupture will spread until it devours everything in its path." The magnitude of it stole her breath. Not just Thornwick, but every village, every city, every pack territory from here to the southern seas. Millions of lives hanging in the balance, and she was supposed to save them all with power she'd never properly learned to use. "I can't," she breathed, taking a step backward. The familiar weight of invisibility called to her like an old friend. How much easier it would be to fade back into the shadows, to return to the simple certainty of scrubbed floors and accepted insignificance. I'm nobody. I'm worthless." But even as the words left her lips, the blood moon's light seemed to pulse with reproach, and deep in her bones, something ancient and powerful stirred in disagreement. The ancient power within her bones rose like a tide, washing away the familiar litany of self-doubt with startling force. Worthless. The magic seemed to scoff at the notion, flooding her awareness with images that made her gasp aloud. She saw herself at 7 years old, placing tiny hands on a dying sparrow and watching in wonder as its broken wing mended beneath her touch. She saw the village children who had sought her out after nightmares, instinctively drawn to the peace that radiated from her presence like warmth from a hearth. She remembered the way flowers had bloomed brighter in her mother's garden whenever Mira helped with the planting, how her laughter had been able to soothe even the most colicky infants. "You were never worthless," the power whispered through her blood. "You were dangerous." The distinction hit her like lightning splitting an ancient oak. Thornwick hadn't cast her out because she was weak. They'd hidden her away because she was strong. The council's unanimous choice hadn't been born of disdain, but of fear. They'd recognized something in the mute Omega girl that terrified them, and their only solution had been to make her someone else's problem. They knew, she breathed, understanding dawning like sunrise after endless night. My mother, the elders, they all knew what I was. King Fenris opened his eyes, studying her with newfound intensity. "What you are," he corrected softly, "not what you were. Power like yours doesn't diminish, it only grows stronger with time." Another tremor shook the castle, and she felt the ancient wards groan under increasing pressure. Whatever forces he held in check were reaching their breaking point. Soon choice would be taken from them entirely. The magic would either find release through healing or tear itself free through destruction. Mira looked at her hands, scarred from years of harsh soap and rough work, trembling with exhaustion from the mountain journey. Such ordinary hands to carry such extraordinary responsibility. But as she watched, the blood moon's light caught the old burn mark on her palm where she'd once grabbed a red-hot poker to keep it from falling on a child. She'd acted without thinking, accepting pain to prevent greater harm. The same choice stood before her now, written in larger letters. "The barriers won't hold much longer," Fenris said, his voice strained with effort. Dark veins were beginning to show beneath his skin, spreading upward from his chest like poison ivy. Whatever curse afflicted him was feeding on the magical pressure, growing stronger as his control weakened. "You need to decide now. What happens if I fail?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Then we both die," he replied with brutal honesty, "and everything else dies with us." The words should have sent her running. Instead, they sparked something fierce and bright in her chest. She thought of Tom, the stable boy, who'd taught her to whistle bird calls in stolen moments between chores. Of old Marta, who'd slipped her extra bread despite her own meager wages. Of the children in Thornwick who still played in the village square, innocent of the darkness gathering in the mountains above. I won't let them pay for my cowardice. The decision crystallized with startling clarity. She wasn't choosing between safety and danger. Safety was an illusion that had never truly existed. She was choosing between action and paralysis, between growing into her power or watching the world burn while she cowered in familiar shadows. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted, stepping forward despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I don't know if I'm strong enough, or brave enough, or anything enough." "Neither do I," Fenris confessed, wonder flickering across his harsh features as she approached. "But I know that standing here, feeling your power call to mine, it's the first hope I've had in 20 years. Hope. Such a fragile, dangerous thing. It could lift souls to impossible heights, or shatter them beyond repair." But as Mira raised her trembling hand toward his, she realized hope was also the only force strong enough to bridge the gap between what was and what could be. The space between their palms hummed with potential. Healing or destruction, salvation or doom. Everything she'd been and everything she might become balanced on this single moment. Behind her lay the safety of silence, the comfortable anonymity of being nobody special. Ahead waited a destiny too vast and terrifying to fully comprehend. But she'd been hiding long enough. "Together then," she whispered, and pressed her scarred palm against his. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded into light and sensations so overwhelming that thought became impossible. Magic crashed together like storm waves breaking against cliffs, and Mira felt herself falling forward into a destiny that would remake everything she thought she knew about herself, her power, and the true nature of the man who ruled their fractured world. There was no going back. There was only the unknown rushing up to meet her, vast and terrible and bright as the blood moon burning overhead. The explosion of light gradually faded, leaving Mira gasping on cold stone floors she didn't remember falling to. Her palm burned where it had touched the king's, and when she flexed her fingers, silver light danced between them like captured moonbeams. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying, power flowing through channels that had been sealed for 15 years, awakening abilities she'd barely begun to understand. "Incredible," a voice breathed from somewhere above her, though it wasn't Fenris who spoke. Mira struggled to sit up, her vision still swimming from the magical backlash. The throne room had transformed around them. Where ancient stones had been cracked and groaning moments before, now smooth walls gleamed with restored strength. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on the castle was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. But they were no longer alone. 3 figures stood in the chamber's shadows, and Mira's newly awakened senses immediately catalogued them as threats. The speaker was a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes like chips of winter ice, beautiful in the way of sharp blades, dangerous even in stillness. Beside her lurked a massive man whose scarred face spoke of countless battles, while the third remained hooded, their features hidden but their presence radiating barely contained hostility. "Lady Evangeline," Fenris said, and Mira heard exhaustion in his voice despite his attempt at formality. "I wasn't expecting you so soon." The silver-haired woman smiled, though no warmth reached those cold eyes. "How could I stay away?" The magical disturbance was felt clear to the border territories. Every sensitive in the kingdom knows something momentous has occurred. Her gaze fixed on Mira with uncomfortable intensity. And now I see why. Mira forced herself to stand, swaying slightly as power continued to settle in her bones like sediment in still water. She could feel the king beside her, his presence somehow both familiar and strange after their brief but profound connection. The darkness that had writhed within him was quieter now, contained by barriers of silver light that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. A spirit healer, the hooded figure spoke, voice muffled but clearly female. I can smell the moon's blessing on her. How wonderfully inconvenient. Inconvenient for whom? Mira found herself asking, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. The silver-haired woman's eyebrows rose at the sound, and too late, Mira realized she'd just revealed that her muteness was gone. For those of us who've grown comfortable with the current arrangement, Lady Evangeline replied smoothly, the king's condition has necessitated certain power structures, a council to help bear the burden of rule, advisors to handle matters requiring delicate negotiation. Her smile sharpened. Your healing threatens to disrupt a very carefully balanced system. Understanding crashed over Mira like ice water. These weren't allies come to celebrate the breaking of an ancient curse. They were political predators who'd built their influence on Fenris's weakness, and her presence threatened everything they'd worked to achieve. The healing isn't complete, the scarred man observed, his voice a low rumble. I can still sense the fracture in his soul. One touch isn't enough to undo decades of curse work. No, Fenris agreed quietly, and Mira felt his exhaustion like a physical weight. The darkness is contained, not banished. It will take time and repeated contact to fully repair the damage. Lady Evangeline's eyes glittered with something that might have been relief. Then, perhaps we should discuss terms. The girl will need protection, training, proper accommodation befitting her. Unique status. The council would be happy to oversee her development. The offer sounded reasonable on the surface, but Mira's awakened intuition screamed warnings. She could sense the trap hidden beneath honeyed words, the cage disguised as sanctuary. They wanted to control her, to manage her access to the king and ensure their own continued relevance. That won't be necessary, she said, drawing startled looks from all three visitors. I can speak for myself now. Can you? The hooded woman's voice carried dark amusement. Tell me, little Omega, what do you know of court politics? Of the delicate alliances that keep this kingdom from tearing itself apart? You've awakened power, yes, but power without wisdom is just another form of destruction. The words stung because they held truth. Mira knew nothing of ruling, of the complex webs of loyalty and ambition that govern noble houses. She was still the same village girl who'd arrived here in patched clothes and broken shoes, carrying all her worldly possessions in a threadbare cloak. But she was also something more now, and that something rebelled against the assumption of helplessness. Then I'll learn, she said simply. But I'll learn on my own terms. The scarred man laughed, the sound holding no humor. Bold words from someone who doesn't understand the forces arrayed against her. There are those in this kingdom who would kill to prevent the king's full restoration, who profit from chaos and division. Are you threatening me? Mira asked, silver light beginning to gather around her clenched fists. I'm educating you, he replied. The real tests are just beginning. The silver light around Mira's fists pulsed brighter, responding to the surge of defiance that coursed through her veins. She felt Fenris shift beside her, not moving away, but positioning himself in subtle support. The gesture steadied her more than she'd expected. Educating me by intimidation? Mira's voice carried a new edge, shaped by power that was still settling into her bones. Or are you simply testing whether I'll fold under pressure, like the frightened village girl you assume me to be? Lady Evangeline stepped forward, her movements predatory despite their grace. Child, you have no conception of what you've stumbled into. The king's curse wasn't some random magical accident. It was a deliberate act of war. Someone wanted him broken, wanted this kingdom fractured and weak. That someone is still out there, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The words sent ice through Mira's veins, but she forced herself to remain steady. Then we'll face them together. Will you? The hooded woman circled closer, her concealed features somehow more threatening than open hostility would have been. What happens when the novelty wears off? When the reality of royal duty crushes whatever romantic notions you're harboring? You'll be a target for every ambitious lord seeking to control the throne, every enemy nation looking for weakness to exploit. She's right, Fenris said quietly, and Mira felt the admission like a physical blow. Mira, what we shared tonight, the healing, it's bound us together in ways I'm only beginning to understand, but that connection makes you vulnerable to everything that threatens me. The betrayal in his words shocked her more than any direct attack could have, after everything they'd just experienced, after the trust she'd placed in him despite her terror. He was already retreating behind walls of political necessity. I see. Her voice went flat, carefully empty. So this was all a mistake then? The healing, the returned voice? Should I have left you to tear yourself apart for the greater good? That's not what I meant. Isn't it? Mira turned to face him fully, ignoring the three observers who watched this fracture with obvious satisfaction. You asked me to trust you, to risk everything on faith. I did that. I opened myself to power I barely understand, and connected my soul to yours. And now, what? You want me to hide in some gilded cage while you pretend none of it happened? The scarred man stepped forward, his massive frame casting shadows across the restored throne room. The girl has spirit, I'll grant her that. But spirit won't protect her from assassin's blades or poison in her wine. Lord Commander Marcus Thorn. He introduced himself with a mocking bow. I've spent 20 years keeping this kingdom from falling apart through careful negotiation and strategic brutality. Your presence threatens to unravel everything we've built. Everything you've built, Mira corrected, understanding crystallizing like frost on glass. While he suffered, while he fought alone against forces that were slowly destroying him. You didn't save this kingdom. You profited from its king's agony. Lady Evangeline's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath her diplomatic smile. Careful, little Omega. You're treading dangerous ground. No, Mira said, power surging through her voice until the words rang like struck metal. I'm standing on it for the first time in my life. The admission seemed to surprise even her. She'd spent 22 years learning to make herself small, insignificant, forgettable. Safety had always meant invisibility. But safety was an illusion that had never truly protected her. It had only limited her. These people wanted her to return to that cage, to heal the king just enough to keep him functional while they maintained their grip on power. The blood moon rises again in 6 months, the hooded woman said, her voice carrying dark promise. If the healing isn't complete by then, the curse will reassert itself with doubled strength. You have half a year to accomplish what you began tonight, if you survive that long. The timeline hit Mira like a physical blow. 6 months to master abilities she'd never properly learned to use, to navigate a political landscape designed to destroy her, to somehow complete the healing of a man whose soul had been fractured by forces she didn't understand. And all while targets painted themselves on her back in royal paint. 6 months, Fenris repeated, and she heard the weight of impossible calculations in his voice. The winter court convenes in 3. Every major house will be here, along with delegates from allied kingdoms. If they sense weakness, they'll tear us apart, Lord Commander Thorn finished. Unless, of course, we take steps to ensure stability. The Council's protection comes with certain understandings about authority and access. There it was, the trap laid bare. Accept their control or face the consequences alone. Mira looked at Fenris, hoping to see some spark of the man who'd risked everything to ask for her help. Instead, she found only a king calculating odds and weighing political necessities. The real test wasn't her power. It was whether she had the courage to claim her destiny without permission. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, and Mira realized this was the moment everything truly began. Not when she'd touched the king's cursed soul, but now, when she had to choose who she would become in the aftermath. No, she said, the word falling into the throne room's charged atmosphere like a stone into still water. Lady Evangeline's eyebrows rose in elegant surprise. No? No to your protection. No to your oversight. No to your carefully balanced systems that require a broken king to function. Mira's voice grew stronger with each word, silver light beginning to emanate from her skin in response to her rising conviction. I didn't risk my soul to heal him just so you could keep him caged in politics. Lord Commander Thorne's scarred face darkened. You foolish child. You have no idea what forces you're unleashing. Don't I? Mira stepped forward, and the 3 council members actually retreated. The movement sent a shock of realization through her. They were afraid, not of her power alone, but of what her freedom might cost them. I know that in 6 months, this curse will return stronger than before. I know that healing a fractured soul requires trust, not manipulation. And I know that every moment we waste on these games brings us closer to failure. The hooded woman laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. Trust? In 3 months, every predator in the kingdom will descend on this court like wolves scenting blood. They'll use you against him, or him against you, or simply kill you both and seize power in the chaos. You think love conquers all, little Omega? The word love hung in the air like an accusation, and Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks. Was that what this was? She'd barely begun to understand the connection forged between her soul and Fenris's, the way her newly awakened power seemed to sing in harmony with his damaged essence. But whatever lay between them, it was deeper than politics and more fragile than the council members wanted to acknowledge. I think, Mira said carefully, that 20 years of your way has led us to this moment, a kingdom held together by fear, ruled by a king whose own power was turned against him, protected by people who profit from its weakness. Maybe it's time to try something different. Different enough to get us all killed. Fenris spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice rough with strain. The silver barriers containing his curse were already showing stress fractures, dark veins pulsing beneath the light like infection fighting treatment. Mira, you don't understand the scope of what we're facing. This isn't just about court politics. Whoever cursed me had power enough to shatter an Alpha King's soul. They're still out there, and they'll see your healing as an act of war. The exhaustion in his words struck her like a physical blow. He was retreating again, letting fear and duty override the connection they'd forged in desperate trust. But this time she recognized the pattern, the same withdrawal she'd practiced for years whenever someone demanded too much, pushed too hard, threatened the careful balance that kept her safe. You're right, she said quietly, and saw surprise flicker across all 4 faces. I don't understand the full scope. I don't know who cursed you or why. I don't know the intricate web of alliances that keep this kingdom functioning. She paused, gathering her courage like armor. But I know that everything I've ever truly accomplished happened when I stopped asking permission to exist. The admission cost her, dragging up memories of every moment she'd chosen silence over truth, compliance over resistance. The night she'd watched Tom the stable boy take a beating meant for her, because she was too afraid to speak up the years she'd scrubbed floors in penance for powers she'd never asked to possess. The lifetime of small surrenders that had brought her to this moment, standing in a throne room with magic singing in her veins and 3 of the most dangerous people in the kingdom, trying to convince her to make herself small again. The blood moon gave us 6 months, she said, looking directly at Fenris despite the political predators circling them both. Either we use that time to complete the healing, or we watch everything burn when the curse returns doubled. Your council's protection comes with chains. Their wisdom requires my silence, and their careful balance demands that you remain broken enough to need them. She stepped closer to the throne, power crackling between her fingers like captured lightning. I won't be managed, I won't be controlled, and I won't watch you sacrifice yourself to their fear disguised as pragmatism. Then you'll face the consequences alone, Lady Evangeline said, her diplomatic mask finally falling away to reveal naked hostility. The Council's protection extends only to those wise enough to accept it. Good, Mira replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. Because the girl who needed protection died the moment she chose to heal rather than hide. The ordeal had truly begun. The silence that followed Mira's declaration felt like the moment before lightning strikes, charged with inevitability and destruction. She watched as Lady Evangeline's expression shifted from diplomatic hostility to something far more dangerous, calculation. Very well, the silver-haired woman said, her voice taking on the formal cadence of pronounced judgment. "Lord Commander, please escort Miss Ashwood to the Eastern Tower. She'll require time to reconsider her position." "You can't," Mira began, but Fenris's voice cut across hers like a blade. "Do it." The betrayal hit her with such force that her newly awakened power flickered, silver light guttering like a candle in wind. She turned to stare at him, searching his face for some sign that this was strategy, misdirection, anything but the abandonment it appeared to be. "Your Majesty," she whispered, the title feeling like ash in her mouth. "I'm sorry, Mira." His voice was steady, but she could see the fractures spreading through the silver barriers containing his curse, dark veins pulsing stronger with each heartbeat. "I can't protect you if you won't let yourself be protected." Lord Commander Thorn moved with surprising speed for such a massive man. Iron shackles appeared in his hands, not ordinary restraints, but artifacts inscribed with runes that made Mira's awakened senses recoil. The moment the metal touched her wrists, her power vanished as if it had never existed. "Moonstone-forged manacles," the hooded woman explained with evident satisfaction. "Designed specifically to contain spirit healers, a precaution we hoped never to use, but your independence has forced our hand." The loss of her magic felt like suffocation, like having her voice stolen all over again. Worse, she could sense Fenris's pain spiking as their connection was severed, the silver barriers around his darkness beginning to crumble without her power to sustain them. "You're killing him," she gasped, as Thorn dragged her toward the throne room's massive doors. "Without the connection, the healing will collapse." "Temporarily," Lady Evangeline said with clinical detachment. "Long enough to remind you both of the consequences of defying necessary authority. The Eastern Tower is quite secure, Miss Ashwood. Time will help clarify your priorities." The Eastern Tower. Mira had heard whispers of it even in Thornwick, a prison for magical prisoners, warded against every form of supernatural ability. Those who entered rarely emerged unchanged, and some didn't emerge at all. "Fenris, please." She struggled against Thorn's grip, but without her power, she was just a village girl again, weak and helpless against forces beyond her control. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "This is for your own safety." "This is cowardice," she shot back, desperate fury giving her words cutting edge. "You ask me to trust you, to risk everything, and the moment that trust becomes inconvenient, you hand me over to them." Something flickered across his face, pain, regret, perhaps even love, but it vanished beneath royal composure. "Guards," he called, and armed soldiers materialized from the shadows. "See that Miss Ashwood is comfortable in her new quarters." The word comfortable was delivered with such empty politeness that it felt obscene. Mira watched in growing horror as the 3 council members moved closer to the throne, already positioning themselves to fill the void her absence would create. They'd planned this, she realized. From the moment they'd entered the throne room, they'd been maneuvering toward this outcome. "The Winter Court convenes in 3 months, Lady Evangeline was saying as Thorn began dragging Mira toward the doors. "We'll need to present a unified front, demonstrate stability." Their voices faded as iron-shod boots echoed against stone. But Mira caught enough to understand. They would parade Fenris before the assembled nobility like a tamed lion, proof that the kingdom remained strong despite the magical upheaval, and she would remain locked away, a dangerous variable contained until she agreed to play by their rules. The corridor outside the throne room felt like a tunnel into darkness. Guards flanked her on both sides, their faces hidden behind ceremonial helms that made them look like harbingers of death. The moonstone shackles grew heavier with each step, their runes pulsing with cold light that seemed to leach warmth from her very soul. Behind them, she could hear the council's voices rising in urgent discussion, already planning how to manage the crisis her defiance had created, how to spin the narrative of a dangerous Omega, brought to heel for the greater good. "The Eastern Tower has housed some fascinating prisoners over the years," Thorn said conversationally as they climbed a spiraling staircase that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Spirit healers driven mad by isolation, seers who forgot how to distinguish between past and future, elementalists who eventually began talking to stones. Magical talent requires such careful cultivation. The threat was clear: submit, or join the ranks of those broken by the tower's particular brand of mercy. As they reached the uppermost level, Mira caught a glimpse through a narrow window of the blood moon setting on the horizon. 6 months to complete the healing. But how many days would she lose to this prison? How much damage would the curse inflict while she rotted in magical isolation? The cell door slammed shut with the finality of a tomb ceiling. All her defiance, all her newfound power, all her desperate love, none of it had been enough. She was alone. The cell was smaller than her quarters back in Thornwick, which seemed impossible given that she'd slept in what amounted to a storage closet above the tavern's kitchen. Stone walls pressed in from all sides, unmarked by windows or any hint of the outside world. The only light came from phosphorescent moss growing in deliberate patterns across the ceiling, runes that pulsed in rhythm with the moonstone shackles, creating a cage within a cage. Mira sank onto the narrow cot, exhaustion finally claiming her now that rage had nowhere left to burn. Without her power, the silence felt different than it had during her mute years. Then, she'd carried magic like a secret flame, warming her even when she couldn't speak. Now there was only emptiness where that inner light had blazed. But as the hours crawled past, something began to shift in the quality of that silence. She'd expected isolation, but the tower's stones seemed to whisper with the echoes of previous prisoners. Fragments of conversations, half-remembered spells, the desperate scratching of fingernails against unyielding rock. The wards that contained magical ability apparently preserved the psychic imprints of those who'd suffered here. "Help me," a voice whispered, not heard but felt like an ache behind her eyes. "Please, I can't remember my own name." "The stones are hungry," came another, layered with madness. "They eat memories, thoughts, dreams. Feed them something else, anything else." Mira pressed her hands to her ears, but the whispers came from inside her mind. The moonstone shackles weren't just suppressing her power. They were making her vulnerable to the psychic residue trapped in the tower's foundations. This was how they broke magical prisoners, not through torture or deprivation, but by drowning them in the accumulated suffering of everyone who'd been held here before. "Don't listen to them." This voice was different, clearer, more recent. Mira looked around the empty cell, but saw nothing except shadows cast by the phosphorescent runes in the stone behind the cot. "I left something for you." With trembling fingers, Mira felt along the wall where her narrow bed met the corner. The mortar between two stones crumbled at her touch, revealing a small hollow containing what felt like carved bone. It was a wolf figurine, no larger than her thumb, etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the runelight. The moment her skin made contact, the whispers stopped as if a door had slammed shut. "My name was Elena Brightwater. I was imprisoned here 7 years ago for the crime of healing without the council's permission." The voice came from the figurine itself, Mira realized. Some form of spirit magic she'd never encountered, a way of preserving consciousness beyond death. "You're the one, aren't you? The spirit healer who touched the king's curse." "You're dead," Mira whispered, then flinched at how loud her own voice sounded after hours of supernatural whispers. "Yes, the tower saw to that. But before I died, I discovered something the council has hidden for decades." The carved wolf grew warm against Mira's palm. The curse that fractured the king's soul. It wasn't cast by an enemy. It was created here, in this very tower, by the 3 who now claim to serve him. The revelation hit Mira like ice water. "That's impossible. They're his advisors, his jailers." Elena's spirit voice carried bitter certainty. 20 years ago, Fenris was like you, a healer king who wanted to use his power to actually help his people. The council couldn't control him, couldn't manage his compassion, so they found another way. Memories flooded through the connection. Elena's discoveries, painstakingly gathered during months of careful investigation before her imprisonment. Lady Evangeline consulting with dark mages in hidden chambers, Lord Commander Thorn overseeing the creation of curse anchors disguised as royal regalia. The hooded woman, whose name was Magistrate Vera Blackthorn, weaving fracture spells into the very throne itself. "They split his soul in 2, Elena continued, creating a broken king they could manipulate and control. Every political crisis, every moment of necessary brutality, all orchestrated to keep him dependent on their guidance. But why reveal this now?" Mira clutched the figurine like a lifeline. You've been dead for 7 years. Because tonight, when you healed him, you didn't just repair the damage. You awakened something they thought they'd destroyed forever. His original soul, the one they buried beneath layers of fracture and pain. That's why they moved so quickly to separate you, not to protect you or him, but to prevent you from discovering what they'd done. The Eastern Tower, Mira realized, wasn't just a prison. It was a construction site where the council built the tools of their control. How many healers had died here? How many voices had been silenced before they could reveal the truth? The moonstone shackles have a weakness, Elena whispered urgently. They suppress magical ability, but they can't contain magical knowledge. Everything you learned tonight, every connection you forged, it's still there, waiting. As if summoned by her words, Mira felt something stir in the depths of her consciousness. Not power exactly, but understanding. The silver light that had flowed between her and Fenris hadn't been severed. It had been forced underground, flowing through channels the council couldn't see or block. She was still connected to him, and through that connection she could feel his growing awareness of the truth. The real revelation wasn't that the council had betrayed them. It was that their betrayal had just given her exactly what she needed to destroy them. Mira closed her eyes and let herself sink into the hidden connection Elena had revealed. The silver thread linking her to Fenris pulsed faintly beneath the moonstone's suppression, like a river flowing deep underground. Through it, she could sense his struggle, not just against the curse's return, but against the dawning realization of what had been done to him. Feel him fighting it, Elena's spirit whispered through the carved wolf. 20 years of manufactured helplessness warring with his true nature. They trained him to doubt his own instincts, to rely on their counsel for every decision. But your healing didn't just touch his fractured soul, it reminded him who he used to be. The connection suddenly blazed brighter, and Mira gasped as Fenris's emotions flooded through her consciousness. Rage, yes, but not the wild fury of his curse. This was colder, more focused, the anger of a king discovering he'd been played for a fool. Behind it came memories he'd forgotten or suppressed, moments of genuine compassion overruled by practical necessity, healing gifts discouraged as weakness, dreams of a better kingdom dismissed as naive idealism. He remembers Mira breathed, wonder cutting through her exhaustion. Some of it. The deeper the council buried his true self, the harder it is to excavate. But you've given him something they never expected, an anchor to who he really is. Through the silver thread, she felt Fenris testing the boundaries of his throne room prison. The curse anchors Elena had shown her in memory were still there, woven into crown and throne and royal robes. But now that he knew what to look for, he could begin the delicate work of unraveling 20 years of magical manipulation. He needs time, Elena cautioned, and he needs you to be ready when the moment comes. The council believes they have you contained, that the moonstone shackles make you helpless. Use that assumption. Mira stood and began examining her cell with new purpose. The phosphorescent runes weren't just for light. They were part of a larger ward network, designed to drain magical prisoners of hope as much as power. But Elena was right about the moonstone's limitation. It suppressed ability, not knowledge, and Mira's awakened gifts had come with an intuitive understanding of how magical systems functioned. The runes feed on despair, she murmured, tracing the glowing patterns with one finger. They're designed to amplify the psychic echoes, to make prisoners believe they'll never escape. But what if someone fed them something else instead? Clever girl. What did you have in mind? Instead of fighting the whispers from previous prisoners, Mira opened herself to them. Not their madness or suffering, but their anger. Their desire for justice. Their dreams of freedom cut short by council machinations. The tower had been designed to contain these emotions, to prevent them from coalescing into anything useful, but it hadn't been designed to contain a spirit healer who understood how to weave fractured pieces into something stronger. Yes. Elena's voice carried fierce approval. Gather them. They've been waiting decades for someone who could give their rage purpose. The work was exhausting without her active power, requiring her to rely on pure will and understanding instead of magical ability. But slowly, carefully, she began connecting the scattered psychic imprints. a fire mage who'd refused to burn villages for the council's political games, an earth singer imprisoned for healing blight the council had deliberately spread, a dozen others whose only crime had been possessing power independent of the throne's control. They made us into weapons, came a new voice, clearer now that Mira had given it form. Turn us against our enemies. Make them pay, whispered another. Make them remember what they destroyed. The accumulated anger of decades began to flow through the ward network, transforming its purpose. Instead of draining hope, the runes started broadcasting something else entirely, a call to every magical being in the kingdom who'd ever been forced to hide their gifts or submit to the council's authority. The blood moon may have set, Elena observed with satisfaction, but you're creating something just as powerful. A rallying cry for those who refuse to be managed. Through her connection to Fenris, Mira felt his sudden alertness as the transformed ward network reached beyond the castle walls. Across the kingdom, healers and mages, who'd learned to suppress their abilities in exchange for safety, began to feel the pull of something larger than themselves. Let them think the moonstone shackles make me helpless, Mira said aloud, her voice carrying new confidence. Let them believe I'm just another broken prisoner. By the time they realize what I'm actually doing, it'll be too late to stop. The carved wolf figurine pulsed with Elena's approval. 3 months until the winter court convenes. 3 months for you to gather an army of the discarded and forgotten. The council thinks they've neutralized the threat by separating you from the king. Mira smiled, feeling power flow through her in ways the moonstone couldn't detect or contain. Not magical ability, but something more dangerous, purpose backed by righteous fury and a growing network of allies who'd been waiting their entire lives for someone to lead them against their oppressors. They have no idea what they've actually done, she whispered. The real battle was just beginning. The real battle was just beginning, but first, Mira needed to understand exactly what she was committing to. As days blurred into weeks in the Eastern Tower, the transformed ward network grew stronger, reaching further into the kingdom with each passing hour. Through Elena's guidance and the connection to Fenris, she began to grasp the true scope of what lay ahead. Show me, she whispered to the carved wolf one morning, pressing the figurine against her forehead. Show me what we're really fighting. Elena's spirit consciousness merged with hers, and suddenly Mira could see beyond the tower walls. Not with her eyes, but through the network of magical energy she'd awakened. Across the kingdom, hidden practitioners were emerging from decades of careful concealment. A village healer in the southern provinces, who'd spent 20 years pretending her remedies came from herb lore rather than spirit magic. Twin battle mages who'd deserted the royal army rather than burn refugees for strategic necessity. Even in the capital city below, she sensed stirrings among the castle's own servants, scullery maids like she'd once been. Discovering they possessed gifts they'd never dared acknowledge. But with revelation came consequences. The council wasn't blind to the shifting magical currents. They're moving to counter you, Elena warned, as new visions flashed through their connection. Magistrate Blackthorn is dispatching hunters to the southern provinces. Anyone suspected of unsanctioned magical practice is being brought to additional facilities. Towers like this one, designed to break spirits before they can unite. Mira felt ice form in her stomach as she watched families torn apart, healers dragged from their homes in the dead of night. Her rallying cry had given hope to the oppressed, but it had also made them targets. Every person who answered her call risked everything, their freedom, their sanity, their lives. This is my fault, she breathed, guilt threatening to shatter her newfound resolve. I'm getting them killed. No. Elena's response crackled with fierce certainty. This was always happening. The council has been systematically eliminating independent magical practitioners for decades. The only difference is that now their victims have something to die for, instead of just hiding until they're found. Through the silver thread connecting her to Fenris, Mira felt his anguish as he became aware of the purges. He was fighting his own battle within the throne room, slowly unraveling the curse anchors while maintaining the facade of cooperation with his handlers. But progress was agonizingly slow, and each day brought reports of more disappearances, more families destroyed by the council's fear of losing control. The Winter Court, she realized suddenly. They're not just planning to parade him before the nobility. They're going to use the gathering to announce new laws, complete registration and regulation of magical abilities. Anyone who doesn't submit to council oversight will be declared an enemy of the crown. Now you understand the true timeline, Elena confirmed grimly. 3 months isn't just when they convene the court. It's when they formalize their stranglehold on magical freedom forever. After that, there won't be any hidden practitioners left to rally. They'll all be dead, imprisoned, or broken. The weight of destiny settled on Mira's shoulders like a mantle of iron. This wasn't just about healing Fenris anymore, or even exposing the council's crimes. It was about preventing the complete enslavement of every magical soul in the kingdom. The consequences of failure stretched far beyond her own life or freedom. She closed her eyes and reached deeper into the network she'd created, feeling the pulse of hope and determination flowing between countless hidden allies. They were looking to her, a mute village girl who'd stumbled into power by accident, to somehow find a way to challenge centuries of established authority. "I don't know how to be a leader," she admitted to Elena's spirit. "I don't know how to plan a revolution or command an army. I'm just—" "You're exactly what they need," Elena interrupted firmly. "Not a politician or a general, but a healer who refuses to let wounds fester just because treating them is dangerous. Trust your instincts, Mira. The same gifts that let you mend Fenris's fractured soul can unite these scattered people into something powerful enough to reshape everything." Mira felt the truth of it resonating through her bones. She might not have military training or noble bloodlines, but she understood brokenness, how to find the hidden connections between damaged pieces, how to weave them back together into something stronger than what had existed before. Standing in her cell, moonstone shackles heavy on her wrists, she made a choice that would echo across the kingdom, not just to resist or survive, but to transform, to take every person the council had dismissed as worthless and forge them into a force that would tear down the systems that had broken them. The Winter Court would convene expecting to witness the final consolidation of their power. Instead, they were going to face a revolution led by the worthless Omega they'd thought safely contained. The plan came to her in pieces over the following days, assembled from fragments of Elena's memories and her own growing understanding of magical networks. It wasn't enough to simply gather allies. They needed to strike at the heart of the council's power during the one moment when their entire system would be most vulnerable. "The Winter Court isn't just ceremony," Elena explained, as Mira traced the phosphorescent runes with newfound purpose. "It's a massive magical working. Every noble house, every council member, every person of power gathered in the throne room while ancient rituals bind them to the crown's authority. That's when they'll attempt to formalize their control over magical practitioners, and that's when the binding spells will be at their strongest. But also when they'll be most concentrated," Mira murmured, pieces clicking into place. "If we could disrupt the ritual at its peak, the entire network would collapse. Not just the new laws, but the foundational spells that have maintained their authority for generations. The question is how to get close enough to the throne room when every approach will be heavily guarded." Mira pressed her palm against the carved wolf figurine, letting Elena's accumulated knowledge flow through her. She saw the castle's layout through a prisoner's eyes, secret passages built for servants, forgotten tunnels from older construction, maintenance shafts for the ward network itself. The council had been so focused on containing her magical abilities that they'd overlooked something simpler. She'd spent her entire life invisible to those in power. "They'll expect an army," she whispered, excitement building in her chest. Mages blasting through the front gates, battle magic and dramatic confrontations. They won't expect a scullery maid walking through the servants' entrance. "You're not a scullery maid anymore, but I remember how to be one. How to carry trays and keep my eyes down and be so unremarkable that guards don't even see me pass." She stood and began pacing the small cell, energy crackling through the network she'd built. "Elena, how many of our allies were servants once? Kitchen staff, stable hands, seamstresses, people who know how to move through noble spaces without being noticed." Elena's spirit form shimmered with understanding. "Dozens, maybe hundreds. The council's purges have been going on so long that half the magical practitioners in the kingdom have learned to hide in plain sight." Through her connection to Fenris, Mira felt his sudden alertness as her intentions crystallized. He was still trapped in the throne room, still playing the role of controlled king. but she could sense his growing readiness. The curse anchors were weakening as he systematically unraveled them, though he had to work carefully to avoid detection. When the moment came, he would be ready to reclaim his true power. The ritual requires his willing participation, Elena added, reading the flow of Mira's thoughts. Ancient laws demand that the king himself speak the words that bind magical practitioners to council oversight, but if his soul is fully healed when that moment comes, he can speak different words entirely. Mira's voice carried fierce satisfaction, words that break their control instead of cementing it. It's dangerous beyond imagining. If you're discovered before reaching the throne room, if the timing is wrong, if any piece fails, then we die as ourselves instead of living as slaves. Mira touched the moonstone shackles on her wrists, feeling their suppression of her abilities. But we won't fail, because they've made the same mistake everyone always makes. They've underestimated what broken things can accomplish when they're properly mended. The network pulsed with responding energy as word spread through hidden channels. Servants who'd spent decades concealing their gifts began making careful preparations. Mages, masquerading as merchants, started positioning themselves along travel routes to the capital. Even in the outer provinces, those who couldn't make the journey in person began weaving their power into the growing web of connection, ready to lend their strength when the crucial moment arrived. You're not just planning a revolution, Elena observed with something like awe. You're healing the kingdom itself, reconnecting all the severed pieces the council broke apart to maintain their control. That's what I do, Mira said simply. I fix what's been fractured. As if summoned by her words, the silver thread linking her to Fenris blazed with sudden intensity. Across the castle, she felt him complete another crucial unraveling. One of the major curse anchors finally broken. Power flooded back into him, not the twisted shadow the council had cultivated, but something clean and bright, and furious with righteous purpose. Soon, his voice whispered across their connection, the first direct communication they'd managed since her imprisonment. Hold fast, spirit healer. The final test approaches, and when it comes, we'll face it together. Mira smiled, feeling the full weight of her network's attention focused on this moment. Hundreds of broken souls, mended and united and ready to fight for something better. The council thought they'd contained the threat by locking her away. They had no idea they'd just given her 3 months to forge the perfect weapon for their destruction. The Winter Court would be their triumph or their tomb, but either way, it would be the end of their tyranny. The Winter Court arrived like a storm front, bringing with it nobles from every corner of the kingdom and a weight of expectation that pressed against Mira's ribs like a physical force. From her tower cell, she could feel the ancient magic stirring as hundreds of powerful bloodlines gathered in the throne room below, their combined presence beginning the ritual that would either cement the council's control forever or shatter it completely. Today, Elena's voice whispered through the carved wolf figurine, urgent with anticipation. They're beginning the preliminary bindings now. Can you feel it? Mira pressed her palm against the cold stone wall, extending her awareness through the network she'd spent 3 months building. The castle hummed with magical energy as old ceremonies awakened, but underneath the formal proceedings, she sensed something else, her hidden allies moving into position like pieces on an enormous game board. A kitchen maid carrying ceremonial wine through the great hall, a stable hand leading horses to the courtyard, who possessed earth-singing abilities. 2 seamstresses adjusting noble robes, their fingers weaving more than just fabric repairs. Dozens of forgotten servants, invisible to the powerful, converging on the throne room with quiet determination. The moonstone shackles, Mira murmured, testing their weight on her wrists. For months, she'd allowed everyone to believe they made her helpless. But Elena's memories had revealed something the council had forgotten. Moonstone suppressed active magical ability, but it couldn't block the deeper connections of a fully awakened spirit healer. Are you ready? I've been ready for 20 years, Elena replied fiercely. Let's remind them what they destroyed when they silenced the healers. The escape itself was almost anticlimactic. 3 months of careful observation had revealed the guard rotations, the moments when the tower's attention shifted elsewhere. Elena's knowledge of forgotten passages provided the route, and Mira's lifetime of moving unseen through spaces where she didn't belong made her invisible even to trained watchers. She slipped through shadows that had hidden countless servants before her, following maintenance tunnels and forgotten stairways toward the throne room. With each step, the magical pressure intensified. The ritual was building toward its climax, ancient words being spoken that would reshape the kingdom's entire relationship with power. "They're binding the noble houses first," Elena warned, as Mira paused at a junction of corridors, ensuring their cooperation before moving on to the general population. "But that means Fenris is still playing his role," Mira whispered, feeling their silver connection pulse with controlled fury. Through their bond, she could sense him standing before the assembled court, speaking the ritual words, while systematically destroying the last curse anchors that bound his true soul. To everyone watching, he appeared to be the council's perfect puppet king. Only Mira could feel the storm of genuine power building behind his controlled facade. She pressed herself against the wall as footsteps echoed through the corridor, guards performing one final sweep before the ritual's climax. Her heart hammered against her ribs, 3 months of careful planning balanced on this single moment of remaining hidden. The footsteps passed. Mira slipped through the final stretch of forgotten passages, emerging behind a tapestry that depicted the kingdom's founding. Ironically appropriate, she thought, since they were about to refound everything. Through the heavy fabric, she could hear Magistrate Blackthorn's voice rising in formal pronunciation. "Let all who possess gifts beyond the natural order submit to the crown's wise guidance. Let none practice magic without the council's blessing. Let the old chaos be replaced by proper order. Now," Elena urged. Before he can finish the binding, Mira stepped through the tapestry into the throne room, and for a heartbeat, nobody noticed. Hundreds of nobles focused on the ceremony, council members concentrated on their moment of triumph, guards watching for external threats, none of them paying attention to one more servant moving through the shadows. Then her presence hit the magical field like a stone dropped in still water. Fenris's head snapped toward her, their connection blazing with sudden intensity. Magistrate Blackthorn stumbled over his words as the ritual energies shifted unexpectedly. Nobles throughout the hall began turning, confused by the change in the room's atmosphere. "Impossible," Blackthorn breathed, his face draining of color. "The moonstone shackles. Suppress ability, not purpose," Mira said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast room. Around the hall, servants began dropping their disguises as her network activated in perfect coordination. "And you forgot something important about broken things, Magistrate. When they're properly healed, they're stronger than they ever were before." The silver thread connecting her to Fenris exploded with power as he finally cast off the last pretense of control. 20 years of accumulated magic flooded back into him, not the twisted darkness the council had cultivated, but the pure healing force he'd once wielded before the curse fractured his soul. "Hello, my king," Mira said softly, meeting his eyes across the chaos of the disrupted throne room. "Ready to fix what they broke?" Fenris smiled, and the real battle began. The moment their reconnection blazed to full power, Mira understood the true cost of victory. Through the silver thread binding her soul to Fenris, she felt the curse's final defense activating, a trap the council had woven into the deepest layers of the binding magic. As his true self emerged and reclaimed 20 years of stolen power, the accumulated darkness began seeking a new host. Not to possess or control, but to completely consume, and it was reaching for her. "Mira!" Fenris's voice cracked with horror as he realized what was happening. Around them, the throne room erupted into chaos. Nobles screaming as servant-disguised mages dropped all pretense. Council members frantically trying to reassert control over rapidly failing magical bindings. But all of it faded to background noise as Mira felt the curse's hungry tendrils wrapping around her consciousness. "It needs a spirit healer to anchor itself," Elena's voice whispered urgently through the carved wolf figurine. "That's why they could never fully control it. They lacked the connecting gift. But if it bonds with you..." The implication hit Mira like a physical blow. The curse would gain access to every soul in her network. Hundreds of hidden allies, all linked through her healing gift, would become conduits for the very darkness they'd fought to destroy. The revolution would transform into something monstrous, turning their moment of liberation into the kingdom's ultimate nightmare. The network, she gasped, feeling poisonous magic creeping along the silver threads that connected her to so many others. Already she could sense distant allies crying out in confusion as shadow touched their minds. It's using me to reach them. Fenris abandoned the ritual platform, power crackling around him as he fought through panicking nobles to reach her side. We'll break the connections, sever every link before... No, the word tore from Mira's throat with absolute certainty. She could feel the curse probing deeper, seeking the central nexus of her gift. But she could also sense something else, the accumulated love and trust of everyone she'd helped heal, the unbreakable bonds forged through months of careful mending. Breaking the connections won't stop it. The curse feeds on fractured souls, remember? Separation is what gives it power. Understanding blazed across Fenris's face, followed immediately by desperate denial. Mira, no. There has to be another way. But she was already reaching deeper into the network. Not to break the connections, but to strengthen them. If the curse wanted access to every healer, every hidden ally, every person who'd ever trusted her gift, then that's exactly what she'd give it. Elena, she whispered, pressing her palm against the wolf figurine one final time. Can you guide them through what comes next? Child, what are you planning? The curse was designed to isolate and control individual souls. It doesn't understand unity. Mira's voice steadied as the plan crystallized in her mind. Around them, the battle raged as her allies clashed with council forces, but she focused entirely on the spreading darkness trying to claim her power. But if instead of one spirit healer holding the network together, it becomes hundreds of healers sharing the burden. The curse's tendrils recoiled in confusion as Mira began deliberately channeling everything she was through the silver threads. Not just her power, but her knowledge, her techniques, her fundamental understanding of how to weave fractured pieces into unified wholes. Every person she'd connected to, every ally who'd trusted her with their broken places, she gave them the tools to become what she was. You're distributing your gift, Elena breathed in amazement, making every soul in the network capable of spirit healing. And when the curse tries to feed on so many unified healers simultaneously, Mira felt the dark magic beginning to convulse as it encountered, not isolated prey, but a web of interconnected wholeness it couldn't comprehend or corrupt. It starves. The price was everything she'd become. Her voice, restored so recently, began fading as the gift that sustained it scattered across hundreds of souls. Her power, awakened through months of careful growth, dispersed into the network like water soaking into parched earth. Even her memories of healing techniques transferred themselves, leaving behind only the echo of what she'd once been able to accomplish. Mira! Fenris caught her as she collapsed, the moonstone shackles suddenly feeling impossibly heavy as her depleted magic could no longer resist their suppression. Stay with me. But she was smiling, even as consciousness wavered. Throughout the throne room and beyond, she could feel the network blazing with shared power. Former servants stood straighter as healing knowledge flooded their minds. Hidden allies in distant provinces gasped as they suddenly understood techniques that had taken her months to master. The curse writhed in fury as its intended anchor transformed into a weapon that turned its own hunger against it. The kingdom has hundreds of spirit healers now, she whispered, meeting Fenris's anguished eyes. Fix what they broke, my king. I gave you the tools. The curse let out one final shriek of rage before dissolving completely, unable to sustain itself against so many unified, healing souls. Mira closed her eyes and let the darkness take her, knowing she'd traded everything she was for everything they could become. The resolution. Silence fell over the throne room like a held breath, broken only by the soft whisper of dissolving shadow as the last remnants of the curse scattered into nothingness. Fenris knelt beside Mira's still form, his hands trembling as he checked for signs of life, barely daring to hope as he felt the faint but steady rhythm of her heartbeat beneath his palm. Around them, the aftermath of transformation rippled through hundreds of souls. Former servants stood in stunned wonder, their minds suddenly filled with healing knowledge they'd never possessed. Nobles who had supported the council's tyranny found themselves overwhelmed by an inexplicable urge to seek forgiveness. their fractured spirits touched by echoes of Mira's gift. Even the castle stones seemed lighter, as if 20 years of accumulated darkness had been lifted from their very foundations. Magistrate Blackthorn lay crumpled near the ritual platform, his connection to the curse's power severing so violently it had left him unconscious. The other council members cowered against the walls, their magical bindings shattered, their authority dissolved along with the dark magic that had sustained it. Without the curse to amplify their control, they were revealed as what they'd always been, frightened, bitter people clinging to power they'd never truly earned. Elena's spirit form materialized beside them, her usual translucent appearance now somehow more solid, more real. The network's transformation had affected even the boundary between life and death, strengthening connections that had been severed by violence and loss. Alive, Fenris confirmed, though his voice cracked with exhaustion and something deeper, a grief for what Mira had sacrificed even as he marveled at what she'd accomplished. But changed. I can barely sense her gift anymore. She gave almost everything away. Elena knelt on Mira's other side, her ghostly hand hovering over the unconscious girl's forehead. Through her spectral touch, new understanding flowed, not just of Mira's condition, but of what her sacrifice had truly created. She's not powerless, my king, she's distributed. Part of her lives in every soul she connected to now. The network doesn't just carry her knowledge, it carries pieces of her essence. As if summoned by Elena's words, people began approaching from throughout the throne room. A kitchen maid who now possessed deep understanding of emotional healing. A stable hand whose connection to earth magic had expanded into something that could mend traumatized spirits. Former nobles who found themselves compelled to use their resources for genuine good rather than personal gain. "We can feel her," whispered one of the seamstresses, tears streaming down her face, like a warm presence in our minds, showing us how to help others the way she helped us. Fenris gathered Mira closer, his own power, finally free of curse taint, flowing through their silver connection to sustain her depleted form. The bond between them had survived her sacrifice, though it too was changed. Where once it had been a bridge between two souls, now it felt like the central hub of an enormous web, connecting him not just to Mira, but to every person she'd touched with her healing gift. Through that expanded awareness, he could sense the transformation spreading beyond the castle walls. In villages throughout the kingdom, people who had hidden their magical abilities for decades were emerging from the shadows, their gifts suddenly amplified by their connection to the network. The rigid hierarchies that had defined their world for generations were beginning to crumble, replaced by something more organic, more collaborative. "What do we do now?" asked one of the nobles who had opposed the council's rule, his voice hushed with the weight of sudden freedom. "The old order is broken, but we need to heal," Fenris said firmly, his gaze never leaving Mira's peaceful face. "All of us." The council's rule left wounds that go deeper than politics or magic. "We need to rebuild not just our government, but our understanding of what strength really means." Elena's form shimmered with approval. "The network Mira created, it's not just about healing individuals anymore. It's a new way of sharing power, of making decisions. No one person controlling everything, but hundreds of voices working together." As if responding to their conversation, Mira stirred in Fenris's arms. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first but gradually clearing. When she tried to speak, only a whisper emerged, her voice once again fragile, her power diminished. But her smile was radiant with satisfaction. "Did it work?" she asked, the words barely audible. Fenris helped her sit up carefully, supporting her weight as she surveyed the transformed throne room. Around them, people were already organizing themselves into groups, healers tending to the wounded, former servants helping confused nobles understand their new reality, allies beginning to plan how to spread word of their victory to the far corners of the kingdom. "Better than we ever imagined," he told her, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You didn't just save us, Mira. You gave us the tools to save ourselves." She leaned against him, exhausted but peaceful, watching as Elena began coordinating with the other spirit healers to establish communication with distant provinces. The revolution was far from over. There would be resistance from council loyalists, confusion as old systems collapsed, the enormous work of building something better from the ruins of tyranny. But for the first time in 20 years, the kingdom had hope that felt real and sustainable. Not hope dependent on one powerful individual, but hope distributed among hundreds of connected souls, each carrying a piece of the light that would guide them forward. The curse was broken, the healing had begun, the return. 3 weeks later, Mira stood at the edge of Thornwick's boundary stones, her hand resting on Fenris's arm as they gazed down at the village that had once deemed her worthless. The frost-bitten mountain settlement looked smaller than she remembered, its rough stone buildings and narrow streets somehow diminished after the vast halls and soaring towers of the capital. "Are you certain about this?" Fenris asked quietly, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her wrist. Through their silver bond, she felt his concern, not for their safety, but for her heart. He knew what returning to this place might cost her emotionally. Mira nodded, though her voice remained the whisper it had become since her sacrifice. They need to see, to understand what really happened. She gestured toward the small group traveling with them, Elena's spirit form, several members of the new council, and a handful of the network healers who had been servants like herself, and they deserved the chance to heal too. The changes in her were evident to anyone who knew how to look. Where once she had moved with the careful invisibility of someone trying to avoid notice, she now carried herself with quiet dignity. Her gift might be diminished, but the knowledge of what she had accomplished, what she was capable of, had transformed her posture, her expression, even the way she met other people's eyes. As their party descended toward the village center, curious faces began appearing in doorways and windows. Mira recognized many of them. The baker's wife who had always sneered at her stammering attempts to place orders, the blacksmith who had never bothered learning her name despite years of her collecting his household's mending. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to shock as they realized who walked among the royal retinue. "Impossible," breathed Councilman Garrett, emerging from the meeting hall where the village leadership was hastily assembling. "The Ashwood girl is supposed to be—" His words died as he took in the silver circlet adorning her dark hair. Not a crown, but the mark of a royal consort, crafted by Fenris himself from metal that sang with protective magic. "Dead?" Mira's whisper carried clearly in the mountain air, amplified by a touch of Fenris's power. "Yes, I imagine that's what you hoped when you sent me as tribute." The village council emerged in a cluster of nervous energy, their faces cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing fear as they recognized the Alpha King beside their former scullery maid. Mayor Aldrich, who had spoken so confidently about her worthlessness 3 months ago, now wrung his hands like a man facing judgment. "Your Majesty," he stammered, dropping to one knee, "we had no idea. That is, we never meant—" "You meant exactly what you did," Elena's spirit interrupted, her translucent form materializing with enough solidity to make several villagers gasp and stumble backward. "You chose to sacrifice an innocent girl because you deemed her expendable. Because her voice was soft and her magic untrained. You decided her life had no value." Mira felt the familiar stirring of old pain, the memories of being overlooked, dismissed, treated as less than human. But alongside that hurt came something new. The warm presence of hundreds of souls across the kingdom who now carried pieces of her gift. Through the network she could sense their love, their gratitude, their absolute certainty of her worth. The village's judgment couldn't touch her anymore. "I didn't come here for revenge," she said clearly, stepping forward to address the assembled crowd that was growing as word spread. "I came because Thornwick is still part of this kingdom, and its people deserve the same chance at healing that everyone else has received." She gestured, and one of the traveling healers stepped forward, a young woman who had once been a kitchen servant in the capital, now radiating the confident authority of someone who understood her own power. The network extends this far into the mountains. Anyone with the gift for healing, anyone who wants to help mend what's been broken, they can be part of something larger. The demonstration that followed was gentle but undeniable. The healer placed her hands on an elderly man's arthritic joints, and the network's shared knowledge flowed through her to ease his pain. A child with a persistent cough found her lungs clearing as healing energy touched her. Most powerfully of all, several of the village's own residents discovered they possessed latent gifts, magic that had been suppressed by the same rigid thinking that had made Mira seem worthless. Through it all, Mira watched with a mixture of sadness and hope. She would never again be the frightened, silent girl who had scrubbed floors in these same buildings. That person had been transformed by fire and choice and sacrifice into someone entirely new, someone who could stand before those who had rejected her and offer them grace instead of vengeance. When the demonstrations concluded, Mayor Aldrich approached her with tears in his eyes. "We were wrong," he said simply, profoundly, shamefully wrong. Can we? "Healing is always possible," Mira replied, her whisper somehow carrying the weight of absolute truth. "But it has to be chosen, by everyone involved." As the sun set behind Thornwick's mountain peaks, Mira stood in the village square she had swept countless times. No longer invisible, no longer worthless, transformed into exactly what her people needed her to become. 1 year later, Mira woke not to the harsh clanging of servant bells, but to golden sunlight streaming through tall windows, and the gentle warmth of Fenris's hand against her cheek. The nightmares that had once plagued her sleep, memories of cold floors and cruel laughter, had faded to distant echoes, replaced by dreams of silver threads connecting souls across vast distances. "The delegation from the southern provinces arrives today," he murmured against her hair, though there was no urgency in his voice. The desperate crises that had marked their first months of rebuilding had settled into a steadier rhythm of growth and change. Mira smiled, stretching luxuriously in their shared bed. Through the network she could feel the gentle hum of hundreds of souls beginning their day. Healers in distant villages tending to the wounded. Former servants now teaching others their newfound gifts. Even some of the old nobles, learning to use their resources for genuine good. The sensation was like being part of an enormous, living tapestry, each thread supporting and strengthening all the others. "Elena says they've discovered 3 more spirit healers among the refugees," she whispered, her voice still soft but no longer frail. Over the months, speaking through the network had slowly restored some of her vocal strength, though she would never again command the raw power she had once possessed. She had made peace with that trade. They rose together, falling into the comfortable routine that had replaced her dawn scrubbing and his isolated brooding. Fenris helped her braid flowers into her dark hair, not because she couldn't manage alone, but because they both treasured these quiet moments of tenderness. She straightened his formal robes while sharing gentle observations from the network's overnight reports. Where once their mornings had been spent in survival mode, now they planned and dreamed. The throne room bore little resemblance to the site of their desperate battle against the council's curse. The oppressive black stone had been carved with silver inlays that caught and reflected light throughout the space. Instead of a single, imposing throne, comfortable chairs arranged in concentric circles accommodated the new governing structure, representatives from every province, guild, and magical discipline working together to heal their fractured kingdom. "Your Majesty," called Marcus, the former stable hand who now served as coordinator for the network's agricultural initiatives. His face glowed with the satisfaction of someone who had discovered profound purpose. "The mountain villages report their first successful joint harvest in decades. The cooperative structures are working." Similar reports flowed throughout the morning session. The rigid hierarchies that had once determined worth based solely on magical strength had dissolved into something far more complex and beautiful. Omegas, who had been dismissed as worthless, now taught invaluable skills to Alphas learning humility. Former servants sat as equals beside reformed nobles, their insights shaped by years of invisible observation proving crucial to understanding their people's real needs. During a break between sessions, Mira stepped onto one of the castle's newly opened balconies, breathing deeply of air that no longer carried the taint of curse magic. Below, the capital city bustled with activity that spoke of hope rather than mere survival. Markets where goods were traded fairly, schools where children learned cooperation alongside competition, healing centers, where anyone could seek help regardless of their social standing. A flutter of translucent wings announced Elena's arrival. The spirit's form had grown stronger over the months, sustained by the network's expanded understanding of life and death's interconnection. "Word from Thornwick," Elena reported, settling beside her former pupil with obvious satisfaction. "They've voted to rename their main square in your honor." Mira laughed softly, remembering the village where she had once swept those very stones in anonymous silence. I hope they chose something more dignified than worthless Omega Square. Ashwood Circle, Elena replied with gentle humor. For the trees that grow strongest after surviving the harshest winters. Through the network, Mira felt a familiar presence approaching before Fenris appeared beside them. His transformation was perhaps even more remarkable than her own. The bitter, isolated king, replaced by someone whose authority came not from fear, but from the genuine love of his people. The silver bond between them had evolved too, becoming less about romantic possession and more about perfect partnership. The Southern delegation wants to establish their own branch of the network, he reported, sliding his arm around her waist. Apparently, word of our miracle kingdom has spread beyond our borders. Not a miracle, Mira corrected gently, watching children play in the courtyard below, former servant children laughing freely with noble-born peers, their games focused on cooperation rather than dominance. Just what happens when people are allowed to discover their true worth. As evening painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, they stood together watching their kingdom settle into peaceful night. Through the network, Mira felt thousands of souls connected by silver threads of understanding and mutual support. Some still struggled with old wounds, but healing was no longer a solitary burden carried by one frightened girl in the darkness. She was no longer the worthless Omega sacrificed by her village, nor the single spirit healer bearing impossible responsibility. She had become something entirely new, the living heart of a transformed world, proof that true strength lay not in individual power, but in the courage to lift others toward their own light. The curse was broken. The healing was complete. And this was only the beginning.